Hey everyone, this is Brian from the Tennis IQ podcast. Josh and I hope that you are enjoying the content and discussions that we put out week after week. If you'd like to support the podcast and help us to continue to produce quality episodes, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Currently, we have 3 tiers of support: the fan level at $3 per month, the supporter level at $7 per month, and the champion level at $20 per month. Benefits of joining the Tennis IQ podcast community include episode transcripts, participation in book club discussions, and access to monthly masterclasses with me and Josh. For more on these benefits of support, head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Thank you so much. And now, on to the show. Hello and welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. For today's episode, we are interviewing Matt Futterman. Matt Futterman is a staff writer at The Athletic, where he covers tennis and Olympic sports. In addition to covering tennis, Matt delivered award-winning investigative reporting for the New York Times, writing a series in 2020 called Sledhead that examined the dangers that sliding sports, particularly bobsled and skeleton, pose to the brain. Matt has also covered 7 Olympics, a role that he will continue to play at The Athletic. Matt joined the New York Times as a deputy sports editor in 2017 before moving back to reporting. Before that, he worked at the Wall Street Journal, the Star-Ledger of New Jersey, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. He's also the author of 2 well-received books, Players, How Sports Became a Business, and Running to the Edge, A Band of Misfits, and The Guru Who Unlocked the Secrets of Speed. Matt is married with 3 daughters and lives in Manhattan. He's a longtime marathon runner. He's run 31 of them, including the New York Marathon 13 times, and also plays tennis. He remains annoyed about going 0-8 in singles during his senior year of collegiate tennis at Union College. And we don't talk about that, but we do talk a little bit about his his journey to college tennis and his journey in college tennis, just a little bit. And we know that you will enjoy this conversation with Matt Futterman. We are very excited to have Matt Futterman with us today on the Tennis IQ podcast. Welcome, Matt.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. So we'd like to start the conversation today the way that we often do when we have interviews like this. And could you tell us a little bit about your background, both in terms of the tennis side of things, and also in terms of the journalism side of things, in terms of, your sort of what has led you to doing the type of work that you do with The Athletic?
Well, great. Thanks. I can certainly do that. I'm a child of, I was born in 1969, but I'm a child of the 70s, and I'm a child of the 70s tennis boom in America. And I would say that, my interest in tennis all stems from, that era of all the usual suspects: Borg, McEnroe, Connors, Gerulaitis, Everett, Navratilova, Austin, that period of time when tennis players were really sort of like rock stars. And in a sense, they always have been and always will be. But it was especially so back then. And it was especially interesting, it's a unique time, I think, because you're, growing up in the New York area at that time. New York is not necessarily thought of as like a hotbed of tennis, but it's hard to overestimate, sort of how much, if you were in New York at that time, you felt like you could sort of reach out and touch these high echelons of tennis. I mean, McEnroe was just a kid from Douglaston, Queens. Gerulaitis had grown up in Brooklyn and moved to Long Island, was living on Long Island. They were all sort of around the Port Washington Tennis Club. The U.S. Open, was always, the West Side Tennis Club, and then moved to the National Tennis Center, which is 10 miles away from my house. I mean, these guys were sleeping in their own beds and driving to the U.S. Open finals. And it was and beyond that, separate out the tennis. I had an older cousin who used to hang around at the big clubs in New York, and he would tell stories of leaving Studio 54 at 2 a.m. just as Gerolaitis and his posse was coming in. And they were just around and about, and so it was very easy to get hooked on the sport in that way. Everybody was playing. The courts are packed all the time. Their courts are pretty packed these days as well. But it certainly was the case back then, and that's really sort of how I got completely hooked on the sport. I got hooked on a lot of sports, but I would say tennis was definitely the one that I was most hooked on as a child, and continued to be into my life as I became a bigger grown up person, and then ultimately a journalist.
Yeah, and then you followed your tennis dream, maybe not dream per se, but you went to Union College, played on the team there. And college tennis is a really big thing, bigger now than probably was in the, where you and I are about the same age. So while it was big, I think now it's even, the focus on playing college tennis is even heightened. But what was that experience like for you?
Well, it was really interesting for me because I mean, this will tell you something about the town where I grew up in, which is Larchmont, New York, and I went to Mamaroneck High School. I couldn't make my high school team because I think pretty much every player that was on that team, or most of them, played Division 1 tennis. I mean, it was always Mamaroneck and Scarsdale that were going to either win the state championship, and it's pretty much still true to this day. Or they still are always battling it out for supremacy, certainly in that area, in the southern part of New York, where most of the tennis talent is. But beyond that, it was so I played all the time. But these guys were just great. I mean, so I couldn't make my high school team. And then I got to a small Division 3 college, and was sort of walking by the court. I played rugby my freshman year at college. I had never played a contact sport before, and I thought that would be sort of good for me psychologically. So I tried to do that, and in the spring season, I remember diving at somebody's legs to try and tackle them, and I took a knee to the face. And I remember lying on the ground and thinking, I really think I should go back to the tennis courts. This really isn't for me. And I was sort of wandered by the tennis courts and saw the guys playing, and I thought, I'm actually almost as good as these guys, I think. And one of the really good players on the team saw me playing one afternoon with a friend, and he came up to me and he said, you should, would you want to play tomorrow? You actually look like you're pretty good. And I'm a fine tennis player. I'm not. I would hardly classify myself as a good tennis player, but I was good enough to play, and it was great fun. It was back in the days of you're driving piling into the van with a bunch of players and taking turns driving it, because if the coach was tired and didn't feel like driving it, it was sort of just serious enough, but not too serious. And yes, it has changed, even tennis at that level. And I'm not sure that's such a great thing. I mean, coaches at Division 3 level, they sort of get fired for not winning. And my attitude is like, well, who really cares if you win or lose at that level? I mean, you want to be good, but you really want to have a great experience at playing, I think. And so it's definitely different. I got a call recently, sort of asking for me to donate money to send the tennis team to Florida for spring break. And I thought, well, that would have been nice to go to Florida for spring break to play to practice. But that's the sort of thing that they've been doing for a while now, and just never would have entered the equation back in the late '80s, early '90s when I was on the team.
Very, very interesting story that led you to college tennis. And I actually grew up not too far away in Fairfield, Connecticut. So I'm a little bit familiar with some of the dynamics of the Westchester tennis scene and that sort of thing. So what led you? Was it that your athletic background growing up that led you to journalism and to sports journalism specifically?
I mean, what led me to journalism? I mean, coming out of college, I thought I really wanted to be a novelist, and I spent a year in the fiction writing program at the University of Arkansas. Um, I didn't think after a year of that, I actually dropped out of the program because I just didn't have very much to write about, and I was tired of being in school. And I moved back to New York and worked in book publishing for a couple of years. But what I decided was that I really wanted to make a living as a writer. And making a living as a writer, especially if you want to make a steady living as a writer, pretty much means becoming a journalist. Was sort of gravitating towards nonfiction at that point in my life anyway. And so that was what I decided to pursue. I went to Columbia Journalism School and I was actually a news reporter for 5 years. And it just seemed like, well, two things. It seemed like I liked the fact that the sports writers were really not tied to a desk and moving all around the country and moving all around the world. And I thought that would be exciting. And also, if you're a news reporter, a lot of the way the hierarchy goes is you spend a lot of time covering politicians, and you cover a mayor and then a governor, and maybe then you go to Washington and cover Congress. And a lot of what you're writing about is things that people say rather than what they do. And and I've always felt that action was character. And one of the great things about covering sports is there's a lot of action to write about. And that if you believe as I do, that really sort of can reveal personalities. And that's what I'm trying to do is tell narratives about people. It's better material for writing to me. That doesn't mean there isn't great political writing and great writing on the news side of the newsroom. There certainly is, but I certainly, for my purposes, sports was a really great vehicle to do the kind of writing that I wanted to do.
Yeah, now you're writing for The Athletic, which is, The Athletic was acquired by the New York Times, I believe, in 2022, and has kind of moved its sports coverage there. And you've been covering tennis, you've been covering the Olympics. Tell us a little bit about the journey and, what you're looking forward to with The Athletic, and maybe what kind of opportunities that gives you as a writer and a journalist.
Yeah, well, when it was announced that the Times was going to close its sports desk, I've been on the sports desk at the Times for the last 6 years. I'd been at the Wall Street Journal for about 10 years before that. And nobody, I don't think humans are very good with change, so it was definitely a shock to the system. But within 24 hours, it became clear to me that the New York Times company, wanted me to keep doing what I was doing, which I've been covering tennis and the Olympics, which was, felt really good and was really affirming. They basically, the basic message was, can you just keep doing your job, but do it, for the people on the ninth floor rather than the people on the fourth floor. So it's been kind of a seamless transition, and The Athletic hadn't yet really started covering tennis. They had dabbled in it a little bit this year, at a couple of the big tournaments, but they really wanted to create what they call a real tennis vertical, and they wanted to build it around me, which was, like I said, incredibly both sort of humbling and affirming in a lot of ways. And so I think the idea is, the New York Times has had for years this huge tennis audience. Tennis really, in terms of what New York Times readers read about, and the NFL is always going to be the NFL. But tennis really punches above its weight and is sort of right up there with the NBA in some ways, in a number two slot. Certainly on the digital version. And so the company recognized they had this huge audience. They didn't want to lose it. And The Athletic really is looking for, to build itself. So it's just a matter to go as deep into tennis as the New York Times always did. And that's sort of what I've been doing, and what I've trying to bring to the report there. And like I said, I think if people know one thing about my work is it's very driven by narratives and characters, and sort of the human experience of the sport. even more so than who wins and who loses, probably. And there's really no greater vehicle, I think, in sports to explore that than tennis, which, it's a kind of sport that really is such an MRI of the soul, in so many, in ways that are both good and bad, because I do think, having covered a lot of different sports over the last couple of decades, I've never seen a sport that sort of eats people the way tennis does. And it's from a very, from a very tactical journalistic perspective, it's fascinating to watch, but it's also very painful to watch as well, and to be close to it, and to understand that, these aren't just robots out there. They are, humans trying to do something that is very difficult and very painful, and doing it in front of the whole world, doing it mostly alone, and in a kind of rudderless way. And it can be a very lonely existence. And all of those things really sort of create huge barriers to success, not only in terms of winning and losing, but also success in terms of just general satisfaction and happiness. And I think that's why you see so many people um, have these conflicted relationships with the sport, and even walk away from it at a very high level at very young ages.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned Borg, just in terms of, part of that sort of 70s tennis boom. And yeah, he would be an example of that, in terms of somebody who walked away at a young age. And there's contemporary examples, right? Whether it's somebody like a Naomi Osaka, who of course took a leave of absence, and many players who, I think, and I think you touch on this a little bit. I know um I think it was the first piece that you wrote for The Athletic, what is sort of your welcome piece, welcome to tennis on The Athletic, taking you inside the game like never before. In this piece, you sort of talk about some of the challenging emotions, and maybe some of the reasons why, to get to a position like playing tennis at that level, it requires a certain level of dedication, and just sort of, maybe even tunnel vision on that goal from quite a young age. And it can be lonely out there. Um, would you say that I know you talked about this in this article as well. Would you say that your sort of, I guess, awareness, or um, your focus onto some of these deeper issues with tennis and with sport in general started earlier? I know you talked about that a bit in this article.
Yeah, well, I've certainly suffered more than my share of meltdowns on the tennis court, and the meltdowns and frustrations. And I think anyone who's ever picked up a racket uh, has experienced those, because it's sort of impossible not to. Um, and I think also a lot of this has to do with my upbringing. I mean, my mother was a psychologist, and I was sort of raised to be self-conscious and introspective, and to sort of think about your experience of life, not just sort of float through it. I think that's actually probably not a great quality to have as a tennis player. Yeah, I mean, I think that the person you always go back to when you talk about this subject is Nadal, who it seemingly has no inner monologue, and is so well trained to always be thinking about the next point. What comes next? What comes next? And it sounds so simple, but it's just practically impossible to do, and it takes so much training. And I know Djokovic has talked a lot about his all the work that he has had to put in to get to the point where he can stay in the moment, and not and not either overloaded or underloaded or get distracted, or but just to sort of see the ball and hit the ball and see the ball, hit the ball, play the point, play every point on its own merits. And that's something that if you're very self-conscious and introspective, I think can be really difficult. It can be really difficult to try and pull off because it requires a real shift in how you go through about your everyday life and how you can be most successful potentially on a tennis court.
Nadal's an interesting example because even just looking at him versus, say, Federer or Djokovic, he's the one who figured out his mental game probably earliest in his career, and really just almost from the beginning, he was able to overcome any sort of locker room power or intimidation that Federer may have had. I mean, Federer's record in 2006 was 92-5, and 4 of those losses were to Nadal. As 17, 18-year-old player. And it just showed that, like you said, Matt, he had this sort of mentality. And I think one of the things that Josh and I have noticed with Nadal over the years is that I think he recognizes that his mind is not within his control. Hence, he has all of these little rituals that he does to occupy it and put it in a better space. And that's, of course, evolved over the years. And of course, now we see that this might be nearing the end of Rafa's career. And I'm wondering if that's a narrative that you're interested in as we go into the Australian Open and into 2024.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Rafa, he swears he doesn't have OCD, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure I would agree with his diagnosis on that. But that's for people with fancier degrees than I have to discuss. Certainly, yeah, that is what this year is going to look like for Rafa is something that I'm just incredibly curious about. I was at that match in Australia last year when he suffered that injury, and I'm the farthest thing from a doctor, but I was sitting about 10 rows up, and he was running towards me as it happened, and it looked like he'd been shot or stabbed. All of a sudden, he just had this glare in his eyes as he looked up. It just looked like it's that look that you see on people's faces when they're experiencing a pain that is at a level of intensity and is an experience that they have either never or rarely experienced before. And it's miraculous that he stayed and finished the match. But the next day, when his team came out with that statement and said, it's just this small tear, should be fine, he'll be back for Indian Wells. I just read that and I thought, no way. I said to one of my friends, I said, I don't know that he'll ever play again. And it's great that hopefully he will, but even he is sort of, he wants to come back and wants to play, but I think it was last week, Craig Tiley, the head of the Australian Open, went on and said, he's to this sort of play reveal that he's coming back. And Nadal sort of very quickly said, I'm hopeful and I'm working hard. And, but clearly wanted to manage expectations there. And, I just don't know. I just don't know, what we'll see and how we'll see it. And, I certainly desperately would love to see him play at a high level. He brings something to the game that nobody else does. But I certainly you certainly want all these people to end their careers with their bodies at least somewhat intact. Federer always talks about trying to make decisions at the end of his career that would allow him to go skiing with his kids. And I think it's really important that he be able to go skiing with his kids. As someone who haven't played tennis at his level, but I've skied with my kids a lot, and it's a great thing that I would never want to give up for anything. So yeah, so I don't know what Rafa's sort of farewell tour, if it amounts to that, will look like. But I certainly hope it's everything that he would want to get out of it.
Absolutely, and I think that's something that we'd all hope for. And I think with somebody like a Federer, for instance, last year, he wasn't necessarily able to have that sort of a farewell tour, but he at least had the Laver Cup, which was a nice sort of emotional send off and last hurrah to sort of celebrate a remarkable career. I know you talked. I think it was actually in that same article about sort of this interesting, uh, this interesting point that tennis is at. I think both on the ATP and WTA sides, where sort of a potentially changing of the guard, maybe especially on the men's side, where there's been the big three or big four. And yes, obviously Djokovic is still very much there at the top of the game, but now there's these young guns, right? Led by Alcaraz, with some of the others that are, a bit behind him, and maybe some Americans as well that are, a bit behind that point. Can you talk a little bit, I guess, maybe on both sides, on the ATP and WTA side, about sort of that changing of the guard and what, then maybe the emergence of some of these younger players as well?
Well, I think it's an incredibly exciting time. I mean, yes, I've enjoyed greatly watching the big three and especially the big four when Andy Murray was around, and that's a real sort of golden era that likely won't ever be recreated. Uh, Having said that, these inflection points are really interesting. New faces and new personalities, and I think there's this temptation among people to say, "Oh, well, Alcaraz is just going to take over, and now it's his turn to win 20 Grand Slams," and maybe he will, but it doesn't usually happen that way. Um, it's really hard to win 20 Grand Slams, and I think maybe we lost a little perspective of that over the last decade because you had three guys who did it, and no one had ever done it before. And I mean, the first thing you have to do is you have to stay healthy for a really long time, and already Alcaraz is struggling a little bit with that. He petered out at the end of last season, and is just pulled out of the tournament this week. And he's trying to desperately wants to play in the ATP finals, which he didn't play in last year. Obviously wants to get back to Australia. A high priority to actually get to Australia, which he didn't get to last year. He was supposed to, and then pulled his hamstring. I think in the last workout before he was getting on the plane to fly to Australia. So there's a lot of wild cards that go into this, and crazy things happen, but the thing that always happens is new talent and new personalities seem to emerge, and the game evolves. I mean, just stylistically, forget about the main characters that are involved. There's no question that the game has evolved even in the last few years where players just have to come forward more. And I think a lot of that has to do with Alcaraz because he plays all over the court and comes forward so much, and that if you don't end the point quickly, he's going to end it. And it's almost as though people are rediscovering the front half of the court and everything that can be done there. I don't expect you're going to have 50 serve and volley players that are going to suddenly emerge over the next 5 years, but I do think there is a new emphasis, and you can see it with someone like Ben Shelton, who is so raw and so early in his game, but is already trying to develop that part of his game, that he's not just simply going to sit there and rely on this magical serve and massive forehand. And I think it's the same thing on the women's side, that there is there's an emphasis on athleticism and court coverage, that is good. That can only bring sort of a level of excitement that is just really going to evolve over the next 10 years, I think.
I think when we look at, mental toughness or mental strength at the elite level, there are certain attributes that players have, and certain players may have maybe more super strengths in some of those areas versus others. And I'm always interested in understanding, how did Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, and maybe even Serena Williams on the women's side, how did they maintain that longevity for what they were doing over such a long period of time? And then, because tennis is a combat sport, it's one-on-one, what was really the keys for them in those matchups that allowed them to really be separated from the rest of the tour? Because, if we look at the men's side, those three guys won the vast majority of Grand Slam titles for a long period of time. It was almost like this unbreakable circle of players, So, Matt, as an observer of tennis and seeing maybe what's going on, sort of underneath the covers, beyond the strokes, what do you think are some of the attributes of those great players that's allowed them to stay where they are and to continue to beat even players who are younger and challenging them?
Well, I think it's different for each of them. I do think what we sometimes we overlook, especially these days, is that they did all have dips. They did all have moments where they did struggle in their own ways. But what they did all share is they share a couple of things. One is they shared a desire to come back even when younger players and new talent emerged. I think in the past, what you would have seen, the pattern you would have seen with someone like Federer being confronted with someone like Nadal is he would have just said, "Oh, this is what happens. You guys along. He's got this weapon. He's got this crazy lefty forehand. Hits it high to my backhand with the craziest topspin ever. It bounces up in my forehead. I can't get my racket around it. I've had a great run. Thanks." But he was able to sort of take that on as a challenge and wanted to overcome it, and that sort of set a tone for what you could do going forward, or a different or maybe a different way of reacting to it. And I think Djokovic had his dips as well and was being overcome by it for different at times. He has a winning record against both of them, but there were times when he didn't, and he had some down years. He had some great years, but he also had some down years too. And so, I think the obvious thing that comes through when you look at them, and also when you look at Serena, is they have a network around them, a sort of close-knit, small group of people that were pretty much with them for the bulk of their careers. Serena had a couple of different coaches, but she always had her sister around. Her father was never far. Her mother was was around a lot. She pretty much always had the same management team around her. And the same is true for Djokovic and Nadal and Federer. They all met their spouses, I think, when they were teenagers, and have been with them for a really long time. And that sort of provided them with a level of stability that I have to believe helped them a great deal moving through all this as they're dealing with all the external pressures. So when I see players bouncing around and changing coaches and traveling in different ways, I do worry a little bit about, are they going to be able, what are their anchors going to be that are going to allow them to sustain themselves through the inevitable ups and downs and dips that everybody experiences, not only from year to year, but also in tennis from week to week, because most people lose every week.
Absolutely. And we've talked about in past episodes of the podcast, we've talked about, the tennis, in singles, it's an individual sport, of course, but it's not just them out there, right? It's not just them. It's about building that team around them, whether it's the spouse, whether it's the coach, whether it's the sports psychology professional, strength and conditioning coach, whoever it may be. One person that we've talked a lot about on the women's side is Iga Swiatek, and she probably over the last 2 years or so has probably been the most dominant force on the women's side, even though she's number two right now. And she has talked a lot about the mental side of the game. She has a full-time sports psychology professional, Daria Abramowitz, that she travels with, and that they're really close. Cute to maybe talk just a little bit about her, and maybe how she has, and for a player who's also very young, I believe she's 22, but maybe how she has become one of the real forces of the women's side of the game over these past few years, I guess.
So she is a real force, and she has had this great success. I think even she would tell you, and she would tell me, that she struggles with finding joy in the success and the experience of it. I mean, she spoke when she lost at the Australian Open earlier this year. She spoke of how much she needed to work, how she really understood that she was finding merely relief in the wins rather than joy. And that's a really bad place to be, because it shows you that you're going into your day, you're going into your approach, you're approaching your matches, and you're going into the sort of crucible of competition just hoping to survive it. And that would really wear on your brain. And at the time, she was the number one player in the world, coming off this incredible season. And when I was talking earlier sort of about the uniqueness of this sport and the way it seems to eat people in a way that no other sport does. I think about Tom Brady winning a Super Bowl and then coming back into training camp. You you never hear Tom Brady sort of talk about the pressures of being the greatest quarterback ever so much, or the the struggle of winning the Super Bowl again. I mean, Tom Brady walked into training camp sort of, feeling like the man, and like the dominant, like the guy, and he seemed to be lifted up by all the success. And a lot of the time, I think what Iga experiences and what she has talked about experiences is being weighted down by the success and the pressure that it brings to her, rather than lifted up by it. And that is not uncommon in the sport. You hear people talk in those terms a lot. And so when I think of her, yeah, I think of someone who's an unbelievable tennis player and has great athletic gifts. But I also think of someone who, does struggle to find joy. She really seems to be on a knife's edge. And yes, she has Daria there, but there's an odd reliance on her. I think it was at Wimbledon when on both Daria, but also on the rest of her team when there was a break in play. I think they were closing the roof, and she had taken the opportunity at that time of basically went over to the corner of the court where her team was sitting, and she almost looked like she was pleading with them to give her answers as to what she should do. She was in the middle of a tough, tight match. And, at some point, I sort of wonder if they say to her, what do you do? You're the number one player in the world. You figure, like you have everything you need. Just go play, just go play tennis. Just go be Iga Swiatek. And I think that's something that she sometimes really struggles to understand. Like I said, being weighted down by the moments and the pressure that comes with her position rather than being lifted up by them.
I think it's really interesting what you say about her, and I can see it that, tennis is more about relief rather than being built up by it. And oftentimes this is because players at that level are often left kind of having to prove who they are, having to defend their status so much that it takes some focus off of who they are becoming and what is in front of them and what they can achieve. And there's sort of this balance between what's more important, who I am right now or who I want to be in the future. I think the other thing about the teams, it seems to me, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this, Matt, is over maybe the last 15 or 20 years, the dynamic between players and their boxes has really changed. There's far more interaction now, I would say, within the last 15 years than anything prior to that. And for some players, maybe that's a good thing, but for some others, it's not necessarily. There might be a dependence there, or sometimes it's just a lot of negativity flowing out of the player. Maybe Andy Murray might have been the guy who started a lot of this with the way he interacted with his box and so forth. So I'm curious, your thoughts on what you're seeing with players, how they interact with their boxes. Are there some players who appear to be doing it well versus others who are not?
I mean, I think a lot of the times I interpret it as they're looking for a friend. They're all alone out there on the court, and I do sort of wonder what would happen if they put you put a second chair on the court and allow the coach to sit there, and maybe what would the interactions be like if obviously the quality interactions would come during the changeovers, so maybe that would lessen the outburst interactions that happen during the match. But I mean, there's a couple of different things at work. One thing is it's really good TV. So there's a little, so we see it a lot in that way. And I think, there's players see this behavior and it's sort of become completely normalized and it's what you're supposed to do. And but mostly I do think it's knowing that, when everything is going to hell on the court, I still have these people to rely on. They're there for me. And it's that yearning for some sense of stability as exposure gets larger, as as these players get off the court and the first thing they do is they look at their phones to see how people are evaluating them. So that sort of pressure, I think, could only drive you towards a greater reliance and interaction with your box. But yeah, I mean, if you say haven't watched it, if you haven't been to a tennis match in 20 years, say, and you suddenly go to a tennis match, you are absolutely shaken by, whoa, that didn't used to happen. Um, it's like people they're always, why are they suddenly so in need of a pat on the back every moment? But in some ways, if what we are coming to understand, that sort of positive reinforcement from people is helpful. Maybe careers are longer for that reason. Maybe that's one of the reasons why careers are longer, because it's a less lonely experience and there is more reliance. I do like the fact that there is coaching during the matches now. I think that's positive and helpful, or I should say it's legal now. There always was coaching during the matches, but I like that it's legal now. And I guess the only thing that makes me uncomfortable is, when the interactions are seemingly sort of abusive either way, in either direction, and you do see it in both directions. You also see it being very supportive, but so that's probably not great for anybody's psyche, or great for the game necessarily, but it is good TV.
No, I think it's definitely changed, and I mean, I think we could probably think of examples, whether it's Kyrgios yelling at his box, or Tsitsipas getting a little bit physical, or plenty of other, getting physical with I think his father at one point, and actually causing some harm. And I think there's plenty of examples of that, and I think there's interesting dynamics just yeah on TV to be seen by by stars on both sides. I guess one thing that I think would be interesting to hear a little bit more about your perspective on. I know we talked a little bit about college tennis at the start, based on your journey and what led you to playing college tennis. But it does feel that in recent years, both on the men's and women's sides, there's more and more players that have come through the college tennis ranks and have experience playing college tennis that end up, having a very successful professional career. Can you talk maybe a little bit about that and maybe what that I guess transformation in recent years has looked like? I know you mentioned Ben Shelton earlier as one example of that.
Well, I think what pros and college tennis players have told me is that the quality of play in college has really improved substantially, so that you're not giving up that much by going to college and playing at that level for a few years while your body matures physically, while your mind gets ready for it. I mean, just look, not everybody is ready to go and travel the world largely alone for 11 months when they're 18 years old. Forget about being mentally ready for it. It's also expensive. Not everybody has the money for it. There's incredible pressure of, playing for your next meal. I think the best young talent will always go professional. But I do think there is a level of quality that is going to college now that probably wouldn't have to 10, 15, 20 years ago, because you're starting to see more success by people who get a couple of years of seasoning in that way. And also the colleges have started offering lifetime scholarships, so that you can go for a year or two, but even if you just play for a year, your scholarship and leave, your scholarship stays with you. You get injured, it doesn't work out, you can come back at any time and finish your education for free. So there's just there's just a lot of good arguments to make at this point for giving that a shot, especially on the men's side, where a handful of players aside, you don't usually see the breakthroughs as early as you see them on the women's side.
Which makes Ben Shelton, an interesting exception, perhaps, to that rule, only playing 2 years at Florida. Of course, his dad was a tour player, and so he's got that, kind of part of his background. Although I think as I understand Ben is not a guy who really specialized in tennis very early. I was actually at the USTA national campus last week and talking to some of the people in player development. He was never even on their radar for somebody to invite to a national camp, and then all of a sudden goes to Florida and starts playing 16, 17, really starts getting into it. And you mentioned that enjoyment piece, that joy. That is something that Ben really seems to have when he's out there, that he's really enjoying himself. And I think that's one of the special qualities of what it means to be competitive, is to enjoy battling and competing players.
Well, I think of Ben. I also think of him in the same context of Michaela Schifrin, the great skier. The commonality that they have is they both had parents who were really good at the sport, and they both at a young age did not compete that much. I think the parents believe that, well, one, they believe that they wanted to be, raising a person and not just an athletic robot. But, they also had great confidence in their own abilities to coach their children. And I think, yes, Ben was a late bloomer, but part of that is also a function of his father thinking, I don't need to bring him all over the world to play in these junior slams, and why not just have him work with me at home? I could probably, you can get the experience of playing competitive matches at that level when he's ready for it. And so yeah, I mean, I do think if he wasn't on him not being on the USTA's sort of radar screen, maybe something of a function of, yes, him playing other sports, and also his father not trying to put him on that radar screen, thinking his time will come, he'll, 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 or his time will come or it won't, and and I'm I'm fine with that, and we're all fine with that either way.
That makes a lot of sense. I guess, yeah, one question is, just through following the sport, in as a journalist, as an observer, what have you found to be? I know you've brought up sort of that tight knit team around a player. Have there been maybe any other particular factors that you have found has sort of separated some of the players that have reached the top of the game from the ones that have maybe gotten there quickly and not sustained it, or haven't quite gotten to that level? What have there been any factors that you have seen that has sort of separated different levels of players along the years?
Well, there's certainly a great there's certainly a great advantage to having a parent who played professionally. I think that's becoming pretty clear, that whether it's Tracy Austin's son or Sebastian Corda or Ben Shelton or Taylor Fritz. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Casper Ruud, I mean, Tsitsipas. There's just so many that are coming along, who have a parent, and it's a combination of both nature and nurture, because obviously there's good genes if their parent was super successful at this, but there's obviously great exposure to great experience and coaching and financial resources probably from an early age. So that certainly seems to have a great value at this point. Maybe more value than almost anything.
So, maybe as we begin to wrap up a little bit, Matt, what are some projects, from a tennis perspective that you're working on? You have a couple of books, but not a tennis book yet. I'd love to see if that's on your radar. But what are some projects that you're excited about coming up and maybe the rest of this year and into next year?
Well, I am working on a tennis book. That's going to be my next book coming out, probably in 2026, from Doubleday, which is the working title is The Cruelest Game, which sort of follows a lot of the themes that we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes about this, tennis being this sort of ultimate ecstasy for a handful of players, but a struggle and a crucible and all those other things for most of the rest of the population, and sort of getting inside the modern tour in the way that John Feinstein did back in the 1990s with hard courts. I would say John's theory of the case back then was that most tennis players were spoiled brats. And I would say my theory of the case is a little more empathetic, and that, whatever neuroses they are suffering from, they come by them pretty honestly for a lot of the reasons that we've talked about. So I am working on that. And, we're working, covering tennis at this point, like in this moment, is certainly going to be a big focus on this changing of the guard and these young faces that are coming along, and that really do always come along. The sport does just regenerate itself in some ways that that sometimes makes the people in the sport, I think, a little lazy because they don't market it as effectively. They just sort of rely on the players in the game to sell itself, and they could make it more accessible and more fan friendly and things along those lines. And on, I would say, the darker side of things, anyone who's been reading my work lately knows that there's a pretty clear and intense focus on the unfortunate circumstances of just the all too common sexual relationships and sexual assaults that happen between coaches and young players, especially young women, and the game's reaction to that, which all too often seems to be to look the other way or cover it up, or just not really want to talk or pay attention to it, and not really have sort of a level of effective rules and regulations that might go some distance towards curbing some of that behavior. I mean, it's been discussed a lot. If you're a therapist and you start having a relationship with your patient, you pretty much have to end the therapist-patient relationship. That's part of the standards of of being a psychologist and being a mental health worker at this point. I'm not sure why there is not a similar rule in professional tennis, where you can't legislate people not having relationships, but you can legislate ending a coaching relationship. Not being able to have that coaching relationship if that's the way the relationship has gone. There are all kinds of barriers, and a lot of players, and some players would probably complain about that because there's a cost savings if your spouse is also your coach. But there's also, I would argue, a pretty unhealthy power dynamic that goes along with those relationships. And having heard a lot of the stories of the details of those relationships and how they change the dynamic, it's hard not to see where there are some just huge red flags in all of this, and things that the sport really has to pay more attention to at every level, whether it's the college level or the junior level, or even at the pro tour level when you see it as well.
Absolutely, and I think that's really important work that you're doing. Shining a light on that, and talking more about that, because I think we've seen that in other sports, whether it's gymnastics, whether it's a number of different sports, unfortunately, throughout the years. And tennis unfortunately is no different. So no, I think that's really, really important work that you're doing, both in terms of and that particular topic, but also in terms of everything that you're doing. And really excited to see how the work that you do at the Athletic. And I think being able to cover sport and cover tennis in a little bit of a deeper way, and be able to really get to the root of a player's personality and some of the struggles, and really what's going on behind the scenes. It's not just You're not just covering the score line, and okay, this player beat this player by this score, and then this next player beat this player. It's a lot more than that. It's a lot more about what's really happening behind the scenes, really trying to understand the people that are involved. And I think you're doing really important work, and it's been really wonderful having you on the show today. I've really enjoyed it. Brian, maybe are there any maybe last thoughts or any final questions that you had?
Well, I would agree with you, Josh. I think, Matt, you've presented us with some fascinating perspectives, and I'm sure our listeners will really appreciate and hopefully begin to follow The Athletic and the New York Times if they haven't already, for some great coverage as we end this year and get into next year. There are, as you said, some fascinating narratives with the changing of the guard, maybe a Nadal farewell, this other obviously darker side of the sport, which is super important. And so we just want to thank you for being here and sharing your perspective, and would love to keep in touch.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for your kind words about my work. I'm nothing without readers, so it's great to have them, and it's great to know that things are resonating with people.
Well, that was an awesome conversation with Matt Futterman. And thank you, Matt, for joining us. So I would say for me, one of the biggest takeaways was the performance team, was taught the aspect of our conversation where we talked about how, yes, tennis is traditionally thought of as an individual sport. However, especially at the elite level, which is much of what we talked about today, but also I think we would both make the argument that it's not just at the elite level, also at all levels of the game. It really is a team effort. And I think we talked a lot about the importance of the team that somebody assembles around them, and whether that be the coach. And we talked about how some of these coaching dynamics have changed in recent years, especially with coaching being allowed, and especially in match coaching being allowed, but also other aspects of the performance team, whether that be a sports psychology professional, and maybe the growing importance of it, or maybe the growing visibility of sports psychology professionals. I know we talked about Iga Swiatek and Daria Abramowitz as examples of that. But yeah, whether it be the coach, the sports psychology professional, even the spouse. I know Matt talked about how the big three on the men's side all met their spouses quite early, and had a certain level of stability within their immediate circle and team from a young age. And I think, yeah, that was probably one of the biggest things that stuck with me, just that aspects of that performance team are critical for a player's success, and really sustained success over a period of time.
That also prompted me to think about our interview with Natalie Duran-Bush and Mishi Papich when we talked about the gold medal profile from On the Podium in Canada. And a big part of mental performance was really your mental health, but was the interpersonal relationships as being a key to that. And I know we've discussed that a lot, Josh, and how important that is. The thing I liked was a comment that Matt made. It wasn't necessarily about anybody in particular, but more about the nature of the sport of tennis, in which it provides an MRI into the soul. And I just thought that was a really unique way of looking at it. And it tends to go under the covers maybe more than most sports, exposing different emotions, different bodily sensations, different thoughts that may go through your head. And it is just such a difficult sport, and it really does expose us like that. And so I thought that was a very interesting way of phrasing what tennis can do, how it can expose us in that way. And so I thought that was interesting. But overall, a really great conversation. And I'm sure everybody enjoyed that. And hopefully they can begin to follow Matt's work at The Athletic. And if you have a New York Times subscription, I believe you automatically get The Athletic, right, as part of the app. And if not, they have a subscription model in which you can use as they begin to build out their tennis vertical. So, well, that is our episode for today. Once again, we want to thank Matt Futterman for joining us on the show. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for the two of us, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you are enjoying the content that Josh and I discuss on the show, please rate and review the podcast so other tennis enthusiasts can find it more easily. Additionally, to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, and you can also check us out on Instagram. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership, where you can learn about the benefits of being part of the Tennis IQ podcast community. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.